At 9:38 on the morning of July 25, 1944, a sound began that German soldiers in Normandy had never heard before. It started as a distant hum, like thunder rolling across a summer sky. But this thunder did not fade. It grew louder, and louder, and louder still. Within minutes, the horizon to the north had turned black with aircraft. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the entire German military, looked up from his command post near the Saint-Lô-to-Périgueux road and felt his stomach drop. He had seen air attacks before. Every German officer in France had learned to fear the fighter bombers they called jabots. He had lost 84 half-tracks, just moving his division to Normandy 6 weeks earlier. But this was something else entirely. This was something no German commander had ever witnessed or even imagined possible. The first wave consisted of nearly 600 fighter bombers. P47 Thunderbolts, P38 Lightnings, and P51 Mustangs screamed down over a narrow strip of land just south of the road, dropping bombs, firing rockets, releasing canisters of napalm that burst into walls of orange flame. The attacks were precise, concentrated, and relentless. For 20 minutes, they worked over the German positions. Then they departed. But the attack was only beginning. At 10 o'clock, the main wave arrived. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, arranged in formations that stretched across the sky as far as the eye could see. They flew in precise rows at altitudes between 12,000 and 15,000 feet, each aircraft releasing its payload in sequence. The bombs fell, not in clusters but in carpets, overlapping patterns that saturated a rectangular target zone measuring roughly 6,000 yards by 2,200 yards. More than 3,000 tons of high explosive and fragmentation bombs descended on an area smaller than a modest farm. The sound was beyond description. Soldiers who survived reported that individual explosions became meaningless. The entire earth seemed to be shaking apart. Dust and smoke rose so thick that day became twilight. Men who were not killed outright were buried alive by collapsing trenches, thrown through the air by concussion waves, or rendered deaf and senseless by the sheer, overwhelming violence. Then came the medium bombers, hundreds of B-26 Marauders and A-20 Havocs, adding another 1,000 tons of ordnance to the devastation below. In total, roughly 3,000 aircraft dropped approximately 4,000 tons of bombs onto 12 square kilometers of Norman countryside, in under 2.5 hours. The ground shook so violently that seismographs registered the impacts dozens of miles away. The concussion waves knocked men unconscious, who were not even hit by fragments. Ears bled. Lungs collapsed from the pressure waves. Men who survived without a scratch went mad from the experience, rushing about in the open until they were cut down by bomb splinters. When the last aircraft departed and the dust began to settle, Bayerlein emerged from his shelter and surveyed what remained of his division. The landscape before him no longer resembled the French countryside he had been defending for 6 weeks. The hedgerows were gone. The roads were gone. The carefully prepared defensive positions his men had dug and fortified were gone. In their place was a cratered wasteland that Bayerlein would later describe using a single German word: Mondlandschaft, moonscape. The Panzer Lehr Division had been one of the German military's showcase units, a formation specifically designed to represent the best of German armoured warfare. It was formed in late 1943 from training and demonstration battalions, units that had spent years teaching other soldiers how to fight. The men of Panzer Lehr were not conscripts or hastily trained replacements. They were instructors, veterans, professionals who knew their craft better than almost anyone in the German military. The division was equipped with the latest tanks and vehicles that German industry could produce. It fielded Panzer IV medium tanks and the fearsome Panther, one of the best tank designs of the war. Every one of its 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions rode in armoured half-tracks, a luxury no other German division possessed. Most German infantry rode in trucks or marched on foot. Panzer Lehr's grenadiers could keep pace with the tanks, protected by armour as they advanced. On June 1st, 1944, just 5 days before the Allied invasion, Panzer Lehr stood at full strength, nearly 15,000 men. Over 230 tanks and assault guns, including 99 Panzer IVs, 89 Panthers, 31 tank destroyers, and various other armoured vehicles. More than 650 half-tracks. It represented the best equipment, the best training, and the best leadership that Germany could provide. The division took its name from the German word Lehr, meaning teaching or instruction. These were the men who had trained other units, who demonstrated tactics and techniques to officer candidates, who represented the ideal of German armoured warfare developed over 2 decades of innovation. When Panzer Lehr moved, it moved as a fully mechanized combined arms team, with tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and support units, all working together in practiced coordination. And on July 25, 1944, it had been destroyed, not by enemy tanks, not by artillery, not by infantry assault, but by aircraft. Aircraft in numbers so vast that German commanders simply had no frame of reference to comprehend what had happened. No German general had ever seen 3,000 aircraft attacking a single divisional sector. No German doctrine had ever contemplated defending against 4,000 tons of bombs falling in 2 hours. The scale was simply beyond anything the German military had experienced or imagined. This was Operation Cobra, and it represented the violent culmination of a failure that had been building for years, a failure of intelligence, a failure of doctrine, a failure of imagination. German commanders could not predict American air support because they could not conceive of air power being used in this way. The scale was beyond their experience. The coordination was beyond their capability. The industrial capacity required was beyond their belief. The bombardment of July 25 was actually the second attempt. The day before, on July 24th, the operation had been launched but then cancelled due to poor weather. Unfortunately, not all aircraft received the recall order in time. Between 300 and 400 bombers dropped their payloads before turning back, and many of those bombs fell short into American lines. The 30th Infantry Division, waiting in their assault positions just north of the target zone, suffered the worst. 25 American soldiers were killed, and over 130 wounded by their own aircraft. General Bradley was furious. He had specifically insisted that the bombers approach parallel to the front-line road, minimizing the time they flew over friendly troops. Instead, they came in perpendicular from the north. Air commanders maintained that a parallel approach was impossible given the number of aircraft and the time constraints involved. Bradley later accused them of having deceived him about the attack plan. When the operation resumed on July 25th with clear weather, the perpendicular approach once again produced devastating results. American casualties from friendly fire that day reached over 100 killed and nearly 500 wounded. The 30th Division alone suffered over 600 total casualties, including 64 dead. Among those killed was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. McNair was observing the attack from a foxhole with the 120th Infantry Regiment when a bomb landed nearby. His body was thrown 60 feet from his position. At age 61, he had been serving as the nominal commander of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, part of the deception operation designed to convince the Germans that another invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. His funeral was kept secret to preserve the ruse. Only a handful of senior officers attended. No band played. No guns fired in salute. Yet despite the tragic friendly fire, the bombardment achieved its purpose. The German defensive line had been shattered. What remained was the exploitation. By the summer of 1944, World War II had entered its decisive phase in Western Europe. The Allied landings at Normandy on June 6th had established a beachhead that the Germans could not eliminate. Despite fierce counterattacks and stubborn defense in the hedgerow country, the lodgment grew stronger every day. American forces had captured the port of Cherbourg on June 27th, giving the Allies a major logistics hub. The British and Canadians were grinding forward around Caen, drawing in German panzer reserves and bleeding them white in attritional combat. But the Allied advance had stalled. The bocage terrain of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, favoured the defenders. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow concealed machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, at terrible cost in casualties. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, knew he needed to break out of the hedgerow country and into the open terrain beyond, where American mobility and firepower could be brought to bear. Operation Cobra was designed to achieve that breakthrough. The plan called for concentrated air power to obliterate a narrow sector of the German line, followed immediately by a ground assault that would exploit the chaos before the Germans could recover. It was an audacious concept, using heavy bombers designed for strategic attacks on cities and factories as tactical weapons in direct support of ground troops. Nothing like it had ever been attempted on this scale. The German forces defending the sector around St. Lo had no idea what was coming. They knew they faced American air superiority. They had learned that lesson painfully every day since June 6th. Any movement in daylight attracted immediate attack from the omnipresent fighter bombers. Convoys were destroyed, headquarters were bombed, individual staff cars were strafed on country roads. But the scale of what Operation Cobra would deliver was simply inconceivable. To understand how Panzer Lehr came to be shattered on that July morning, we must first understand what the division had already endured since arriving in Normandy. The unit had been stationed near Chartres, east of Paris, when the Allied invasion began. Orders came to move immediately to the front. Bayerlein objected to moving his division in daylight, knowing from hard experience in North Africa and Italy that Allied aircraft dominated the skies. He requested permission to wait for darkness. He was overruled. Higher headquarters insisted on speed. The march from Chartres to Normandy became a nightmare that veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. Fighter bombers struck the columns repeatedly throughout the daylight hours. P47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons seemed to appear from nowhere, diving out of the sun to rake the road-bound vehicles with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. Bayerlein later reported the division lost 84 half-tracks, 5 tanks, and scores of trucks before it even reached the battlefield. Vehicles that broke down could not be recovered because any stationary target attracted immediate attack. German soldiers began calling the route the Jabo-Rennstrecke, the fighter-bomber racecourse. 6 weeks of brutal combat in the hedgerow country around Caen and St. Lo had bled Panzer Lehr white. The dense bocage terrain should have favoured the defenders, with its sunken lanes and thick hedgerows providing excellent concealment and natural defensive positions. A few well-placed machine guns could hold up an entire battalion. Tanks could be hidden in farmyards and orchards, ambushing American armour at point-blank range. But American artillery and air power negated these advantages. Any concentration of German troops drew immediate fire from batteries that seemed to have unlimited ammunition. Any defensive position that revealed itself was bombed and strafed within hours. The hedgerows that protected German soldiers also trapped them. There was no room for manoeuvre, no opportunity for the mobile warfare at which German panzer divisions excelled. By July 25, the once mighty division had been reduced to roughly 2,200 combat troops and only 28 operational tanks. 12 Panzer IVs and 16 Panthers remained from an original strength of over 200 armoured vehicles. The rest had been destroyed, damaged, or broken down without possibility of repair. The division's infantry battalions were at a fraction of their authorized strength. Companies that should have numbered 150 men had been reduced to 30 or 40. They were exhausted, under strength, and deployed directly in the path of Operation Cobra. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been warning about Allied air superiority for years. After the Battle of Alam Halfa in August 1942, when British air attacks had crippled his logistics and forced him to abandon an offensive that might have reached the Suez Canal, he wrote words that would prove prophetic. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. This was not idle philosophizing. It was hard-won experience from a commander who had seen his supply convoys destroyed, his headquarters bombed, his carefully planned operations disrupted by an enemy he could not effectively fight back against. Rommel understood what was coming. He had seen it firsthand in North Africa, where British and American aircraft had made daylight movement suicidal and nighttime resupply barely possible. In Normandy, Rommel argued bitterly with other German commanders about where to position the panzer reserves that would be needed to throw the Allies back into the sea. He insisted that Allied air power would destroy any large armoured formation attempting to move toward the coast after an invasion began. The experience of Panzer Lehr's march from Chartres proved him exactly right. But the debate had been decided months before D-Day, and the decision had been wrong. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, and General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, who commanded the panzer forces, argued for holding the armour inland for a concentrated counterstroke. They drew on their experience from the Eastern Front, where Soviet air power was far less effective, and where German panzer divisions had repeatedly achieved decisive results through massed counterattacks. They believed that properly concentrated armour could still win battles despite Allied air superiority. Rommel told them they were wrong. He said that Geyer grossly underestimated the Allied air threat. Hitler imposed a compromise that satisfied no one. The panzer divisions were split between forward and reserve positions. Some were placed near the coast where Rommel wanted them. Others were held inland where Rundstedt and Geyer preferred. And crucially, releasing the reserves required Hitler's personal authorization, a requirement that proved catastrophic on D-Day, when his staff refused to wake him, and the panzers sat idle during the critical morning hours. On June 10th, just 4 days after the invasion, a Royal Air Force attack struck the headquarters of Panzer Group West near the village of Lacaine. The bombing killed 18 staff officers, including the Chief of Staff, and effectively decapitated the only command capable of coordinating a major armoured counteroffensive at the moment it was most desperately needed. General Geyer von Schweppenberg himself was wounded. The carefully planned counterstroke that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea never materialized because the command structure necessary to execute it had been destroyed from the air. 3 senior German generals were killed by air attacks in the first 2 weeks of the Normandy campaign alone. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps defending Omaha and Utah beaches, was killed on June 12th when his staff car was strafed. General Heinz Helmich, commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, was killed on June 17th. General Rudolf Stegmann, commander of the 77th Infantry Division, was killed on June 18th. The Allied air forces were systematically eliminating German leadership, making coordinated defense increasingly impossible. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the most powerful armoured formations in the German military, was stationed near Toulouse in southern France when the invasion began. The distance to Normandy was roughly 700 kilometers, a journey that should have taken 3 or 4 days for a mechanized division moving at normal road march pace. It took 17 days. French resistance fighters sabotaged bridges and cut railway lines. Special operations executive teams ambushed columns and assassinated officers. And relentless Royal Air Force fighter-bomber strikes forced the division to move only at night, by circuitous routes, dispersed to avoid presenting concentrated targets. Das Reich arrived in Normandy piecemeal between June 15th and 30th, its tanks worn down by the long road march, its combat power a fraction of what had been intended. Approximately 60% of its tanks broke down from mechanical problems caused by the extended journey. Yet despite all this evidence, despite the daily losses to air attack, despite the inability to move in daylight, despite the destruction of headquarters and the killing of general officers, German commanders continued to be surprised by the scale of American air power. The pattern repeated again and again throughout the Normandy campaign, and the reasons for this repeated failure lay deep in the structure of the German military itself. The Luftwaffe by 1944 had been systematically dismantled as an effective fighting force. The air battles over Germany during the winter and spring had bled away the cream of German fighter pilots. The fuel shortage meant that new pilots received only a fraction of the training time their predecessors had enjoyed. The factories that produced aircraft were themselves under constant bombardment, forcing dispersal and disruption of production. Luftflotte 3, the German air command in Western Europe, possessed a total strength of only about 480 aircraft by June 1944. This included roughly 100 fighters, many at reduced operational readiness due to fuel shortages and maintenance problems. Against this, the Allies deployed over 10,500 aircraft, including more than 5,000 fighters and fighter bombers. On D-Day itself, the Allies flew more than 14,000 sorties against fewer than 320 Luftwaffe sorties. The ratio was roughly 46-1. The decisive blow had been struck months earlier during what became known as Big Week in late February 1944. Allied bombers targeted German aircraft factories with over 3,000 sorties, dropping 10,000 tons of bombs on production facilities across Germany. While factory damage was partially recovered through dispersal programs and heroic efforts by German workers, the loss of experienced pilots proved irreplaceable. Roughly 100 veteran fighter pilots, representing nearly a fifth of the total available, were killed in just 6 days of intensive air combat. Between January and June 1944, over 2,200 German fighter pilots died defending the Reich. In May 1944 alone, 1/4 of Germany's entire fighter pilot force perished. Replacement pilots were being rushed into combat with only a few hours of flight time on operational aircraft. They were easy prey for the experienced American and British pilots they faced. The practical consequence of this attrition was devastating for German ground commanders in Normandy. The Luftwaffe lost its reconnaissance capability over the battlefield. German intelligence officers could not photograph Allied dispositions or track troop movements. They could not detect the massive concentrations of aircraft and armor assembling for operations like Cobra. They operated essentially blind, knowing that the enemy had overwhelming air superiority, but unable to determine exactly what that superiority would mean in practice. German close air support doctrine had been developed in the years before the war and refined during the victorious campaigns in Poland, France, and the early period of the Russian invasion. The system centered on the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, an aircraft that had become the symbol of German military might through newsreel footage of screaming attacks on fleeing refugees and defending armies. The Stuka was designed as flying artillery, with small formations of dedicated dive bombers delivering precision strikes on specific targets. A flight of 3 or 4 aircraft could destroy a bridge, eliminate a strongpoint, or break up a troop concentration with remarkable accuracy. The system worked brilliantly when Germany controlled the skies. In Poland and France, Stuka attacks had a devastating psychological effect on defenders who had never experienced such concentrated air support. But the Stuka required air superiority to operate effectively. It was slow, with a maximum speed of only about 240 miles per hour, and vulnerable to enemy fighters. Its fixed landing gear created drag that made it an easy target. Against modern opposition with competent fighter cover, the Stuka was a death trap for its crew. The German system for requesting and coordinating air support was also fundamentally different from what the Americans developed. Liaison teams called Fliegerverbindungsoffizier were embedded with forward ground units. But these teams did not communicate directly with aircraft overhead. Instead, they encoded requests with target coordinates, transmitted them back through Luftwaffe headquarters channels, and missions were then briefed, planned, and launched from airfields in the rear. The process took hours, sometimes half a day or more, between request and execution. The Americans built an entirely different system under the leadership of Brigadier General Elwood Pete Quesada, commander of the 9th Tactical Air Command. Quesada was a 40-year-old aviator who had been flying since the 1920s and had survived 8 airplane crashes during his career. He understood both the capabilities and limitations of tactical air power from direct personal experience. Quesada established his headquarters in Normandy 1 hedgerow away from General Omar Bradley's command post. They shared meals daily. They coordinated operations personally rather than through chains of liaison officers. General Bradley later described Quesada as a brilliant, hard, and daring air support commander who understood that air power had to serve the ground forces, not operate as an independent fiefdom. Quesada's signature innovation was called armored column cover, first employed on July 26, 1944, the day after the Cobra bombing. The concept was elegantly simple but revolutionary in its implications. 4 P47 Thunderbolts flew continuously overhead, an advancing armored column, relieved by a fresh flight every 30 minutes, from dawn to dusk. In the lead Sherman tank of each column, an air liaison officer was equipped with a VHF radio, the same type used in the aircraft, allowing direct communication with the flight leader overhead. When the tankers spotted a target, whether a German defensive position, an artillery battery, or a concentration of enemy vehicles, they could call in an airstrike within minutes. The response time from request to bombs on target could be as little as 15 minutes. When no immediate targets presented themselves, the Thunderbolts ranged up to 30 miles ahead of the column, seeking out and attacking artillery positions, machine gun nests, and defensive positions before the tanks ever encountered them. Enemy forces along the line of advance were hit repeatedly before the American armor arrived, their positions marked by columns of smoke and secondary explosions. The results were spectacular. During the 3rd Armoured Division's advance from July 26 through 31st, P-47s operating under the Armoured Column Cover system struck hundreds of targets with 0 friendly fire incidents, a sharp contrast to the tragic short bombing during the Cobra bombardment itself. General Bradley wrote that for about 2 miles the road was full of enemy motor, transport and armour, many of which bore the unmistakable calling card of a P-47 fighter bomber, namely a group of 50 caliber holes. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the perfect weapon for this role. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II at approximately 17,500 pounds fully loaded. It mounted 8 50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition and could carry up to 2,500 pounds of external ordnance. That was roughly half the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress carried by a single-seat fighter. The P-47's air-cooled radial engine gave it crucial survivability for the ground attack mission. A liquid-cooled engine like that in the P-51 Mustang could be killed by a single bullet through the coolant system. The Thunderbolt's Pratt and Whitney radial could absorb tremendous punishment and keep running. Pilots joked that the P-47 landed better on its belly than on its wheels, and many proved the point by bringing their aircraft home despite catastrophic damage. Over 15,000 P-47s were built during the war. They flew more than 540,000 combat sorties, with a loss rate of only 0.7%. Thunderbolt pilots claimed 86,000 railway wagons, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed from D-Day through VE Day. No single aircraft type did more to implement the tactical air power revolution that German commanders failed to anticipate. German commanders had no equivalent capability and no framework to understand what they faced. Even at the height of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Luftwaffe committed only 8 Stuka groups with 324 aircraft to support the entire invasion of the Soviet Union across a front of over 1,000 miles. The notion that an enemy could deploy thousands of fighter bombers simultaneously across a theatre as a continuous umbrella was simply outside the German frame of reference. Perhaps the most catastrophic German intelligence failure was the systematic dismissal of American industrial capacity. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year in May 1940, Hitler's advisors told him the figure was propaganda. American military aircraft production in 1939 stood at fewer than 3,000 planes per year. The numbers Roosevelt cited seemed impossible, the boasting of a nation that had never demonstrated serious military capability. They were not impossible. In 1939, the United States produced just over 2,000 military aircraft, while Germany produced over 8,000. By 1944, American factories were turning out more than 96,000 aircraft per year. Germany managed roughly 40,000. The Americans were building nearly 2.5 times more planes than Germany, and American aircraft were on average much larger and heavier. In terms of airframe weight, a more meaningful measure of industrial output, the disparity was 5.5 to 1. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, confirmed that accurate information about American aircraft production plans had been available to German intelligence throughout the war. But Hitler and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring dismissed the figures as false and impossible. They could not conceive of an industrial mobilization on this scale because the German economy, constrained by raw material shortages and balance of payments problems, could not achieve anything comparable. The organizational architecture of the German military compounded all these problems. Göring, as head of the Luftwaffe and second man in the Nazi hierarchy, treated the Air Force as a personal political empire. He insisted that everything that flies belongs to me. The Air Force High Command operated largely independently from the Army High Command. Requests for air support from ground commanders had to navigate separate channels, competing priorities, and bureaucratic obstacles that the American integrated system avoided entirely. Hitler deliberately fostered inter-service competition to reinforce his own authority as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. The result was rivalry rather than cooperation between the services at every level. The chief of the German General Staff often did not even know the operational status of Luftwaffe units, leading to plans that assumed air support which could not actually be delivered. The breakthrough achieved by Operation Cobra was devastating in its scope and speed. On July 25th, Despite the massive bombardment, American progress was disappointingly slow. The combination of friendly fire casualties, stunned troops, and disrupted formations meant that the ground attack achieved only about 2,000 meters of advance on the first day. German survivors, despite their ordeal, fought back with the stubborn professionalism that had characterized the Wehrmacht throughout the war. But General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps and known throughout the army as Lightning Joe, made a crucial decision. Rather than wait for the infantry to consolidate their gains, he committed his armored divisions early on July 26th. The tanks pushed through the shattered German positions and found nothing but chaos behind them. By July 27th, the German front disintegrated completely. The 7th Army reported 7 distinct ruptures in its defensive line, with no reserves available to seal any of them. By July 28th, the 4th Armored Division had advanced 12 miles and captured the town of Coutances. On July 30th, the critical road junction at Avranches fell to American forces. On August 1st, General George Patton's Third Army was officially activated, and 100,000 troops poured south through a gap barely 5 miles wide. The static warfare of the hedgerows was over. The mobile campaign across France had begun. At Roncy on July 28th, P47 pilots caught a massive German column trapped on an exposed road while attempting to escape the closing pocket. The aircraft attacked in relays for hours. Pilots claimed 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces destroyed in a single devastating engagement. German soldiers who survived described roads so choked with burning wreckage that movement became impossible in any direction. Total German losses during the 6 days of Operation Cobra exceeded 2,500 killed and 20,000 captured. They lost over 100 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed or abandoned. The 7th Army had been gutted. The German position in Normandy, so carefully constructed over the preceding weeks, had collapsed. Bayerlein's assessment of what happened to Panzer Lehr came from interrogations conducted after the war as part of the United States Army's effort to understand German operations. His words have become some of the most quoted testimony from the entire Normandy campaign. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he said. Back and forth the carpets were laid, artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, and all roads and tracks destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Several of my men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Over 70% of my soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. When Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, who had replaced the wounded Rommel as commander of Army Group B, ordered Bayerlein to hold the line at all costs. Bayerlein's response has become one of the most haunting exchanges of the entire war. Out in front, everyone is holding out, he said. Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews, they are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They are lying silent in their foxholes because they are dead. Yet incredibly, even after Operation Cobra, even after the destruction of Panzer Lehr, even after the collapse of the entire German position in Normandy, the lesson was not learned. Less than 2 weeks later, Hitler ordered another massed armoured counterattack directly into the teeth of Allied air superiority. Operation Lüttich, launched in the early morning hours of August 7th, 1944, was designed to cut through the American lines at Mortain and reach the coast at Avranches. The objective was to sever Patton's supply lines and trap the Third Army, reversing the disaster of Operation Cobra through a bold counterstroke of the type that had worked so brilliantly earlier in the war. Hitler demanded 8 of the 9 panzer divisions remaining in Normandy and 1,000 Luftwaffe fighters for the operation. Von Klug, who understood the hopelessness of the situation, could assemble only 4 divisions with between 120 and 190 tanks actually committed to the assault. The Luftwaffe contribution was negligible, with barely any aircraft available to support the attack. The assault began shortly after midnight under cover of darkness and heavy fog. Initial progress was encouraging. German panzers advanced several miles before dawn, catching American units by surprise and threatening to reach their objective. For a few hours, it seemed that the operation might actually succeed. Then the fog lifted around noon, and the destruction began. Royal Air Force Typhoons flew nearly 300 sorties against the German columns, firing more than 2,000 rockets and dropping bombs on the exposed armor. American P-47s from the 9th Air Force contributed over 200 additional sorties. The attacking aircraft found German armor concentrated on open roads with nowhere to hide, the exact situation that Allied pilots had trained for throughout the preceding months. August 7, 1944, became known among Allied airmen as the Day of the Typhoon. By early evening, the Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army reported to Supreme Command West with a stark assessment. The armoured operation had been at a standstill since early afternoon due to the employment of fighter bombers by the enemy and the complete absence of German air support. Allied pilots claimed between 120 and 150 tanks and assault guns destroyed at Mortain. Post-war analysis later revealed significant overclaiming, a common pattern in air-to-ground combat, but the operational effect was undeniable. The counterattack that was supposed to reverse the defeat had only deepened it, extending German forces westward into a salient that Allied forces could now encircle. The failed offensive at Mortain set up the catastrophic encirclement at Falaise. The retreating remnants of Army Group B were trapped in a pocket that war correspondents called the Corridor of Death. American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north closed in from both sides, while Allied aircraft attacked anything that moved within the shrinking perimeter. Post-battle surveys at Falaise found roughly 500 tanks and assault guns abandoned along with thousands of other vehicles. Individual divisions that had once numbered over 15,000 men emerged as fragments. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the same formation that had taken 17 days to reach Normandy in June, escaped with only 450 men and 15 operational tanks. Investigation after the battle revealed that the direct destruction caused by air attack was actually lower than wartime claims suggested. Only about 11 armoured vehicles at Falaise could be definitively proved to have been destroyed by aircraft. But this statistic misses the essential point entirely. The psychological and disruption effects far exceeded the physical destruction. Vehicles were abandoned by crews who fled rather than face death from above. Columns that might have escaped were forced to halt, disperse, and hide, allowing ground forces to overtake them. Command and control collapsed completely because any radio antenna attracted immediate air attack. The German army in France was not simply defeated. It was paralyzed by an enemy operating in a dimension where the Wehrmacht had no answer. Von Kluge, surveying the wreckage of his command, wrote to Hitler in terms that could not be misunderstood. In the face of the total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield. This was not defeatism. It was a simple statement of military reality. But Hitler dismissed such assessments as the complaints of cowardly generals. Within days, von Kluge was dead, having taken poison after being recalled to Berlin under suspicion of involvement in the July 20th assassination attempt. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, who had served as Rommel's naval aide throughout the Normandy campaign, offered what may be the most strategically penetrating observation of the entire disaster. Utilization of the Anglo-American air forces is the modern type of warfare, he wrote. It is turning the flank not from the side but from above. The Germans understood flanking movements. They had perfected them in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, in the great encirclements of the Russian campaign in 1941. But this was a flank they could not defend, a dimension of warfare in which they had no effective response. The enemy was above them, everywhere, all the time. The pattern of German surprise at Allied air power had been building throughout the war. At Alam Halfa, in August 1942, Rommel first encountered truly decisive British air superiority and was forced to abandon an offensive that might have reached the Suez Canal. His supply columns lost 400 trucks to air attacks in a matter of days. It was there that he wrote his famous observation about savages fighting modern European troops. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American air power had been poorly employed, with aircraft parceled out in penny packets underground commanders who did not understand how to use them effectively. The resulting disaster led directly to a fundamental reorganization. Field Manual 120, published in July 1943, declared that land power and air power were co-equal and interdependent forces. It established the principle of centralized control of air assets with decentralized execution, the foundation on which Quesada later built his innovations. By the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, roughly 4,000 Allied aircraft faced only 1,500 Axis planes. The air superiority was so complete that an invasion fleet of 2,800 ships achieved tactical surprise despite crossing the Mediterranean in daylight. At Salerno 2 months later, German forces nearly threw the Allies back into the sea, but Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reported that Allied air and naval superiority had forced his Panzer Corps onto the defensive just when victory seemed within reach. Each of these experiences should have taught the Germans what they would face in France. Each provided evidence of the scale and effectiveness of Allied tactical air power. Yet the lessons were not absorbed. The institutional barriers were too strong, the cognitive biases were too deep, and so the surprise at Normandy was not really a surprise at all. It was the predictable culmination of a failure to learn from repeated experience. The men of Panzer Lehr, who survived the Cobra bombardment, carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of what they experienced. Those who did described events that strained the imagination, the earth heaving like a living thing beneath them, the air itself becoming unbreathable from dust and explosive residue, the complete disorientation as every familiar landmark disappeared into a cratered wasteland indistinguishable from the surface of the moon. They had been among the best trained soldiers in the world, serving in one of the finest armored formations ever assembled. They had been rendered helpless by an enemy they could not see, could not fight, and could not comprehend. Their training had prepared them for combat against other armies, for tank battles and infantry assaults and artillery duels. Nothing had prepared them for this, for the sky itself becoming a weapon that could annihilate an entire division in a matter of hours. Bayerlein survived the war and spent years afterward trying to explain what had happened. In his post-war writings and interrogations, he returned again and again to the Cobra bombardment, describing it in vivid detail as if still trying to process an experience that defied understanding. He could describe the events, he could quantify the losses, but the fundamental question of how the Americans had achieved such devastating concentration of force remained beyond his grasp. The answer to why German commanders repeatedly failed to predict American air support lies in understanding that this was not a single intelligence failure, but a systemic collapse across multiple dimensions. The Luftwaffe's destruction left ground commanders without reconnaissance. German doctrine had no framework for air power employed on the American scale. Institutional barriers prevented effective coordination between air and ground forces. And at the highest levels, accurate intelligence about American industrial capacity was dismissed as impossible propaganda by leaders trapped in assumptions formed by their own limited experience. The 4,000 tons of bombs that fell on Panzer Lehr in under 2 hours did not represent a surprise in any conventional sense. German commanders knew the Allies had air superiority. They knew attacks would come. They had been living under that threat for 7 weeks since D-Day. But the scale, the coordination, the integration with ground operations, all of this exceeded what German planners could anticipate because it exceeded what their experience allowed them to envision. The German military had achieved its greatest victories through bold maneuver, tactical flexibility, and the combination of tanks, infantry, and dive bombers working together. They assumed their enemies would fight the same way, only less well. They never understood that the Americans had built something fundamentally different, a system of air-ground cooperation that could concentrate overwhelming force at a single point within hours. An industrial base that could produce aircraft faster than they could be shot down. A doctrine that treated air power not as a supporting arm, but as a decisive weapon in its own right. The soldiers of Panzer Lehr, who died on July 25, 1944, were victims of that institutional blindness. They faced an enemy their commanders had dismissed as incapable, fighting with resources their intelligence had declared impossible, using methods their doctrine had never contemplated. The finest training in the world could not prepare them for a sky turned black with 3,000 aircraft. No foxhole could shelter them from 4,000 tons of bombs. They were destroyed not by a failure of courage or skill, but by a failure of understanding at the highest levels of German command.